Besides that, ma malakat aymanukum, it doesn't mean a sex slave. It doesn't mean a concubine. Arabic is a very rich language. They have half a dozen words to describe concubines. There's Surriya, Jariya, Ama, Mamluka, and so on. Very, very precise terms. Why isn't it using any of these other words that clearly mean concubine? So some scholars suggested that it refers to wives, because, your right hand, your oath, those that are under your oath, under your authority, and so on. Okay. Um, so yeah, some said, well, some argue that maybe they're enslaved women who are taken as wives. All right. So this brings us to marriage in Byzantium, in the Roman Empire. They had two common forms of marriage. One was called cum manu, or with hand, or underhand, or under the authority of one's hand. And the other one was called sine manu, without a hand or out of hands.
Peace, everyone, and welcome to the Real Talk Podcast. I'm Tehran, joined by my co-host Roxana, and today we have a special guest, Dr. John Morrow, to discuss one of his latest works that critically examines traditional narratives surrounding slavery and Islam, which, in my opinion, offers fresh insights into longstanding debates about the subject. And to give a bit of a background on our guest, Dr. Morrow is a renowned author in Islamic studies, known for his critical examinations of historical narratives and ethical considerations in modern Islam. He has published extensively on these topics as well as on interfaith dialogue. And as I've already mentioned, Dr. Morrow's latest work, Islam and Slavery, released in 2023, critically examines traditional narratives surrounding slavery and Islam and serves as an antithesis to Professor Jonathan A.C. Brown's Slavery and Islam, released in 2018. So to get started, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Morrow, and thank you for joining us to speak about a controversial, sensitive, but nonetheless fascinating topic in which
Yeah,
no civilization comes out clean.
sure. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
All right. And so, as I mentioned, the topic of Islamic slavery is really fascinating, though it's not really something I've deeply looked into as my time as a Muslim. I mean, as a Black American, I've mostly been taught about the transatlantic slave trade for obvious reasons. And I felt like I knew all about slavery, given how ingrained it is in US history and the Black American experience. But learning about the Trans-Saharan slave trade, or how some people call it the Islamic slave trade, that Muslims engaged in, made me realize that slavery was also a significant part of Islamic societies. There were various categories of slaves. There were administrative slaves, military slaves, who obviously shaped Islamic history in significant ways, domestic workers, and even concubinage, which produced notable figures like Shajar al-Dur, Roxelana, who was the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, the famed Ottoman ruler. And under Islamic law, these individuals had certain rights and protections. And according to some 19th century European travelers, would say that their bondage was tolerable, which prompts this question. Some argue that Muslims historically treated enslaved people better than Christians, suggesting that slavery in the Islamic world was more humane than in the West. Do you find these comparisons accurate, or might they oversimplify the complexities of slavery in both contexts?
Well, these are the lies we are told. Slavery in the South was also presented in idyllic fashion. It was defended and justified on religious and biblical grounds. It was even argued that it was beneficial to enslaved Africans and that they should be grateful to their masters. I mean, after all, they brought them out of the dark jungles of Africa, the poor pagans that they were, and forcibly converted them to Christianity. Now they're saved, so hallelujah. The Muslims have done the same. It's funny, well, really, it's sad. But when you look at the pro-slavery literature produced by Muslims, it finds uncanny parallels to the pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist literature produced by Christians. If you look at the European Christian slave codes, you find that they mirror the Arab Islamic slave codes. We're faced with the same monster.
Mm.
Slavery is slavery. Murder is murder. Kidnapping is kidnapping. Sexual assault is sexual assault. Genocide is genocide. Should we be arguing about which genocide was worse? Bosnia, Rwanda, the Holocaust, the transatlantic slave trade, the Trans-Saharan slave trade? As the Quran relates, whoever takes a life, it will be as if they killed all of humanity. And whoever saves a life, it will be as if they saved all of humanity. Muslims who claim that Muslims treated enslaved people better and that Islamic slavery was more humane than Christian slavery are ignorant or deluded. They should read accounts of Muslim slave raids. They're absolutely horrific. They should look at the art that depicts them. They should even look at photographs, historical photographs of slavery in the Muslim world, and they should study statistics. It's estimated that 10 million Africans were enslaved as part of the transatlantic slave trade. That's the low ball. That's the lowest estimate that scholars have come up with. The highest estimate puts the number at 100 million. As for the Trans-Saharan slave trade, which virtually nobody talks about, the estimates vary from 5 million, 7 million, and 28 million. As for the indigenous genocide in the Americas, estimates range from 1 million to 8 million to over 100 million. Since over 80% of Africans died before reaching the slave markets in the Muslim world, it's believed that the death toll from 1400 years of Arab and Muslim slave raids into Africa could have been as high as 112 million. So remember, the death rate for the Atlantic Passage was about 10%. Crossing the Sahara on foot is another issue altogether. And many of the males that survived died during the process of castration. So these are the horrors that we need to remember.
In terms of sort of building that narrative or recasting past figures, specifically within a narrative that Muslim apologists might have created. In your book, you mentioned that the Prophet Muhammad and the Imams, specifically the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, as portrayed in Islamic sources, are treated like literary figures rather than historical ones. Could you elaborate on this and explain maybe a little bit how that view has influenced your academic approach in your book?
Sure. Once you treat a text as sacred, as the literal, eternal, and uncreated word of God, or the words of his infallible prophet, messenger, or imam, you effectively shut down your faculty of reason. One should not approach a text with blind faith. At the same time, one should not approach it with disbelief. We should strive to examine a text from a position of neutrality and objectivity. When people say God said, the prophet said, the imam said, it places them in a position of receptivity. One is wary to object. After all, opposing the prophet or the imam would be apostasy, right? You're afraid you're going to cast yourself out of the house of Islam. It's a power play. It's a form of spiritual abuse and manipulation. It's a way to shape and control people. Critical thinking requires people to preface such statements with, it is reported, it is alleged, it is claimed that so and so said so and so. And remember, it's never firsthand. These are not primary sources. It is always at least six people in the chain. So and so said that 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 he heard his uncle say that his grandfather said that the prophet said. All right, let's remember that. So, and often when they translate these books of hadith, they go straight to the Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The Messenger of Allah said, but they never translate the whole chain that came before it, which is like, an endless chain of hearsay. So,
Which, if I
um,
could add, when I was showing my wife a hadith on Sunnah.com,
yes,
and she can read Arabic, and then she was reading the Arabic translation. She was actually surprised by all of the people mentioned in the chain that because she's not really into Islamic scholarship like that, and when she reads hadiths, it's always so and so said that the Prophet said. But she was actually
yes.
quite surprised reading how long these chains are, and it kind of threw her mind for a spin.
It's
Um,
it, it's incredible, and those are books. Those are books that were compiled about 300 years after the passing of the Prophet. I'm speaking about the canonical Sunni books of traditions. The Shi'i ones are even later than that, and some of the latest books that they produced, like Majlisi, is 1,000 years after the Prophet. You can imagine, right? How long that isnad would be. But, of course, people will, they'll brush this aside and say, well, the traditionist, the muhaddithun, they already did this work and they decided that these traditions were authentic and so on. And, case close. More research is not necessary, nor is it desirable. Um, all these traditions are authentic. But really now? The lives and sayings of the Prophet and Imams are full of contradictions and inconsistencies. Some can be reconciled, but others cannot. Case in point, there are pro-slavery traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad and the Imams. Okay? I'm talking hardcore pro-slavery traditions. And there are anti-slavery abolitionist traditions. Clearly, they can't both be correct,
Right.
right? So, it's either there's an abolitionist Islam or there's a slave master Islam. There's nothing in between there.
So you're not necessarily attacking the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or the
Oh,
Imams,
absolutely not.
because
As
that's
far as
always
I'm
the
as far as I'm concerned, I am defending his integrity and his reputation from people who slandered him after his passing. And we also need to remember who these people were. The people who assumed power after the passing of the prophet were the people who had fought him tooth and nail throughout his prophetic mission. All right? The Umayyads. And so these are the people who produced these narratives, right? So, um, yes, yes.
so the suspicion is warranted given the contradictions that, hey, you kind of can't say the Prophet Muhammad or the Imams were this way when it came to slavery when you find narrations that are equally showing the opposite, which, then is that what kind of inspired you to write your book, which initially was intended as a response to Jonathan Brown's work, or did it evolve differently? Because yeah, you're definitely taking an opposite position than what I understand of Brown's work is trying to convey of the topic of Islam or slavery.
Sure. He wants to defend the tradition as it stands. He believes that that's what makes him a faithful believer and a Muslim. Um, I want to make sure that everything is aligned with the Quran first and foremost. So, how did this book come about? Well, I was asked to review slavery and Islam by a journal called Reading Religion. As scholars, they send us lists of books, and then, we review books for journals. And I was very excited that he had published a book on this topic. I had read Misquoting Muhammad, and I had thoroughly enjoyed that. And I thought that, okay, I was hoping that his views would reflect my own, but I was shocked. So I wrote a review. If you don't mind, I'd like to read it. It's just a page, and it will set the tone. So this is the review that I wrote. In Slavery and Islam, Dr. Jonathan A.C. Brown, the Al-Walid ibn Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization at Georgetown University, devotes over 400 pages to support his conviction that slavery and concubinage are permissible according to the Quran and the teachings and practice of the Prophet Muhammad. He is adamant that God and his messenger allowed, condoned, and supported them. And I have all the page references here. In his words, and I quote, "The permissibility of slavery and concubinage is undeniable in the Quran." Okay. Rather than abolish sexual slavery, Brown asserts that Muslim jurists embraced the practice fully and took it to its maximum. He admits that, and I quote, "the number of concubines taken by Muslims jumped dramatically with the early Islamic conquests." Brown also stresses that in Islamic law, consent for sexual relations was assumed or irrelevant. Not only does he argue that sex slaves played a central role in Arab and Ottoman slavery, but he goes as far as to trivialize the age of consent. Moreover, he argues that freedom is not a fundamental human right in Islamic law and treats serial polygamists who had hundreds of sex slaves as moral exemplars. Brown equates opposition to the institution of slavery and sexual servitude as opposition to the messenger of God. He considers those who oppose slavery but refuse to condemn the prophet to be hypocrites. Well, guess that makes me a munafiq. When faced with dissenting views on the disputed subject of the legitimacy of slavery in Islam, Brown's strategy is to respond with a loaded trick, question, and a theological trap. This is the question he uses when people confront him. Did the Prophet Muhammad commit a grave moral wrong? For Brown, a Muslim does not remain a Muslim if he or she answers in the affirmative. Consequently, he provides a jurisprudential justification for the practice of takfir, namely the excommunication of so-called heretics and apostates, and provides ample evidence that Muslims have a long history of enslaving other Muslims who do not share their ideology. Brown may claim to believe that slavery is wrong. However, he makes an important disclaimer, and I quote, "As a Muslim myself, I cannot condemn it as grossly intrinsically immoral across space and time. To do so would be to condemn the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad, and God's law as morally compromised." However, rather than support Islamic abolitionists, he assumes the role of the devil's advocate, devoting an inordinate amount of time in his book to dismissing, debunking, and repudiating their arguments as violating the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Sharia. If one rejects the views of Muslim scholars who spurn slavery, is one an opponent or supporter of this evil and abominable institution? In fact, Brown wonders whether slavery is in the DNA of Islam. In his words, "We cannot pretend it is not part of our religion." It may be part of his, it's not part of mine. I just want to be very clear about that. Brown's entire work, and I'm almost done, is an ideological defense of slave master Islam. That it comes from a white American Muslim is even more abhorrent. This is the product of a conscious choice. His work is not simply a survey of historical opinions on the permissibility of enslavement, human bondage, sexual captivity, subjugation, and violation. It is a validation of those views. Alternative interpretations of Islam, which are abolitionist and emancipatory, are amply available. He is perfectly familiar with their arguments and evidence, namely that sexual relations are only permissible in wedlock, and that the Prophet Muhammad stated that slave traders were the worst of human beings. Brown, however, has deliberately decided to denounce them. The fact remains that there is not a single verse in the Quran that commands slavery. None. The verses that touch upon the topic are descriptive. They deal with a temporal, socioeconomic reality. Slavery is neither an article of faith, nor is it a religious obligation. In fact, the Quran encourages and even requires Muslims to emancipate enslaved people. As far as the exponents of Islam's spiritual, moral, ethical, and egalitarian tradition are concerned, the Quran, the Prophet, and Islam introduced a system that would reform the practice of slavery and abolish it entirely and forever. Rather than select the sharp and narrow path, Brown has selected the wide and shallow one of the classical Islamic status quo. And since he likes to confront critics with a question, this review ends with a question, not of my own, but one that God poses in the Quran. What will make you know what the steep path is? It is the freeing of a slave. So that's the review. I submitted it to the journal, and the editor, responded, and she says, I think you're misrepresenting Dr. Brown's views. And I say, have you read his book? She says, no. Wow, I'm just so impressed at the rigorous peer review, right? She didn't even read the book. Yeah, but I saw that he posted something, on the internet where he says he doesn't believe in slavery. Well, he doesn't believe in slavery now. It doesn't mean he doesn't believe that it was okay in the past. When exactly that happened, he can't say. But yeah, and so, to me, that upset me. It's kind of like a declaration of war. And fine, I'm going to set out and, turn this book review into a book, and which is exactly what I did. His book is Slavery in Islam. Mine is Islam and Slavery. Why? Because we're dealing with two sides of the same coin. All right? I want Muslims to know that there is another view. There is another perspective on the topic. All right? What he is defending is the majority view transmitted through the tradition. However, from the 7th century to the 21st century, there have always been Islamic abolitionists, right? And so, yeah, I wanted to share their voices with the community.
And one of the arguments that you make, or in your sort of in the framing that you're trying to do, which is sort of detaching how slavery became established and how it was practiced in post-prophetic Islam from the Prophet himself,
Absolutely.
the Quran itself.
Mhm.
You've argued, or you suggested in several places in your book that the second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, played a significant role in shaping the sort of Islamic imperial slavery blueprint that you don't think can in any way be attached to the Prophet. Can you explain what led you to this conclusion?
According to the Islamic tradition, Umar was a slave master before Islam
Mhm.
and after Islam. And, people tell me, well, the Prophet was a slave master. But they don't, maybe not. But what we do know is that he emancipated those slaves, right? Zayd, he emancipated him and he adopted him. And Baraka, he emancipated her and she became his close companion. There were, hold on. So anyhow, let me continue. So he was the owner of Zunaira al-Rumiyya, a European Christian woman, whom he made the collective concubine of his clan, the Banu Makhzum. You can imagine what that entails. I won't describe it. He did free her, but why? If slavery was permissible under the Prophet, why would he feel compelled to do so? According to history, Umar oversaw the conquest of Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, Armenia, and Persia. He was also instrumental in the invasion of the Maghreb. These conflicts flooded the markets of the Middle East with tens of thousands of slaves and concubines. After the conquest of a part of Palestine, Caesarea, Umar, who ruled out of Medina, was sent 4,000 Christian slaves, which he distributed as war booty. According to Islamic tradition, Umar bought, sold, and distributed slaves. He owned 7 concubines during his caliphate. The Hadith literature reports that his sex slaves would serve as guests while topless. According to Islamic tradition, Umar institutionalized concubinage. It's reported that he prevented separating a slave from her child, decreed that the children of concubines were legitimate and equal to the children of free women, that slave women who gave children to their masters could not be sold, and that concubines who had given children to their masters would be emancipated upon the death of the latter. There is no historical evidence to support the claim that Umar issued such edicts. On the contrary, these rulings appear to have been attributed to him by jurists who live hundreds of years later to give them credibility. Okay, so people can say you're bad-mouthing Umar and so on. I am simply sharing what the sources say. And here I have some doubts about some of these things. Like, did he really introduce these laws to, attenuate the harms of concubinage? I don't think so. I think that in order to give weight and credibility to the rulings, jurists who lived hundreds of years after him just attributed uh, these rulings to Umar. Like Umar did this, right?
Much like the Pact of Umar.
Absolutely,
But
which
then,
actually it kept growing and growing and growing until the 12th, 13th century. It keeps growing and becoming more restrictive and more oppressive. And they claim that Umar, issued it. But we do have another pact of Omar, a covenant of Omar, which is very, very similar to the covenants of the Prophet with the Christians of Najran and these other communities, in which he gives people all kinds of rights and protections and so on. So you see, there are different images here of Umar. So there's a contradiction, right? So Allahu Alam. I'm just saying this is all
why
you know.
attributed these edicts to Umar and not back project them to the Prophet, like we know have happened with many other
Because
rulings?
they knew there weren't concubines at the time of the prophet. They were very few and far between. There was no like, big, huge, large and industrial scale, slave trade. That only happened, during the Umayyads and the Abbasids. There was no such thing, during the prophet's mission, the 23 years in Mecca and Medina, no such thing. Now, does Umar have any redeeming qualities when it comes to slavery? It's claimed that he scolded Amr ibn al-As for enslaving free people in Egypt, saying, "Since when did you enslave the people, though they were born from their mothers in freedom?" This is great. I love this thing. Don't enslave free. People are born free. Who the hell? Who are you to enslave them? I love this hadith. Did he say it? Allahu alam. However, we know for a fact that he himself and the troops he commanded enslaved people who were born free. They did not just enslave prisoners of war, they enslaved non-combatants, men, women, and children, and they sold them like cattle. So, Umar, like Uthman and Muawiyah, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ayyubids, the Fatimids, the Mughals, the Ottomans, and other dynasties and empires, they were imperialists, right? We need to recognize that. If Spanish imperialism was wrong and British imperialism was wrong and French imperialism was wrong, maybe we need to recognize that Arab and Ottoman imperialism was wrong as well. But in any event, the Prophet Muhammad was not an imperialist, and I can prove it. There isn't the slightest clue that he had ambitions beyond Arabia. None at all. What is more, Imam Ali refused categorically to participate in any of the wars of conquest that took place after the passing of the Prophet. Surely that is significant. And the Imams that followed him, they all insisted that every single jihad that took place after the death of the Prophet was illegitimate.
Mm.
Whoa, that's anti-imperialism right there.
So sounds like you don't believe the Prophet views slavery as a permanent institution.
No, I don't believe that the Prophet believed in slavery at all. Most of his earliest followers and supporters were enslaved or formerly enslaved people. Yasser, Sumaya, Ammar, Zunaira, Bilal, Salman, Suhaib, Shukran, many others. Why would they follow someone who believes in slavery and who is going to enshrine slavery?
Mm.
Slavery is God's will. Nobody can prohibit it. Obey your masters. Runaway slaves will burn in hell. We must revive slavery. Is this what he was preaching? No, no way, no how. He was a Christ-like figure who was in the business of freeing the enslaved. The Quran supports that claim, and so does a body of bona fide hadith. I mean, if you want to look at the evidence, we could skim through some of the evidence from the Quran and the hadith, if you wish, if time permits.
We definitely, yeah, we definitely want to have a look a bit more closely at specific verses
Sure.
and hadiths that on both sides of the argument.
All
Um,
right.
but
Mhm.
one thing I wanted to ask you first
Sure.
is in your book you mentioned radically changing your views over several issues over the years. I was just curious, what was the most significant evolution in your thinking and what prompted it?
Well, it's a process that took place over the course of nearly 4 decades. I
Mm.
call it death by 1,000 cuts. Now, you have to remember that I read the Quran, right? And I said, wow, this is gorgeous. It's beautiful. This really encapsulates what I believe in. And so, all right, I'm a Muslim. I had never met a Muslim before. I had never read any books about Islam before. This was in Canada in the 1980s. This is before all these waves of migrants and so on. It was very difficult to find a Muslim, right? And then, finally I found a mosque in downtown Toronto and, I found a sheikh and I took my shahada. But since then, I have been kicking and screaming and fighting back. It's not a matter of evolution in my thinking. It's a matter of attempted devolution. Muslim scholars wanted me to lower my moral standards. They wanted to convince me that it was permissible to beat one's wife, marry prepubescent girls, enslave human beings, perform female genital mutilation, sexually assault enslaved women, torture people, slaughter non-combatants, convert people by force. They were the most sexist, misogynistic, and even racist people I had ever come across. They call themselves Islamists. I call them Satanists, the people. I've written about this. I mean, I wrote an article called Nightmares in Takfiristan in one of my books called Restoring the Balance, using the Quran and the Sunnah to guide a return to the Prophet's Islam. So these are issues that are very difficult for me to discuss. However, they need to be expressed and they need to be heard. Muslims of culture and conversion have had similar experiences. So I'm trying to steer the ship of Islam to safer shores. Of course, I'm in the midst of a mutiny and I might be forced to walk the plank. But you will see that many of the books that I wrote, the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world, protecting the rights and freedoms of religious minorities, tolerance, all of that. My book on hijab, okay? No, women don't have to be covered from head to toe and locked away. My book, the most controversial Quranic verse, why 434 does not promote violence against women, idribuhunna, beat them. Yes, so these are all things that profoundly offended my soul. And so, yes, many of my books, that's what they deal with, these issues, right? I am responding to, what was diametrically opposed to what I had read in the Quran.
So it sounds like you didn't have any challenges when trying to reconcile the historical reverence or what we find in the literature with contemporary ethical concerns. That was something Roxana and I spoke about earlier. Did you go through a process of going along to get along, like you see with so many converts, and then it's only like at the end of having gone through that process, if they even make it out, not having end up in jail or losing their life, that they start self-reflecting? Or yeah, from the beginning, you were
Oh,
like,
from the beginning. I
okay.
was shell-shocked. I was shell-shocked. I was stunned. I was confused. I was perplexed. I was profoundly disturbed by these people and what they were teaching. Um, but my faith in God comes first. I've always been a mu'min or a believer, always. From the time I was a little kid. I always remember that I had profound love for God. I was like 2, 3 years old and so on. And yes, I always felt that God was everywhere and in everything. I don't believe in God because I'm a Muslim.
Mm,
I became a Muslim because I believed in God.
facts.
And I read this book and I said, wow, that's me right there. So ethics are innate. They form a part of our fitra, our natural predisposition. The Catholics, they call it natural law. The Jews, they would call it the law of Noah. I refuse to lower my moral standards to make them align with ones that are lower or to abandon them entirely. This is what the advocates of so-called Sharia demand: conform or be cast out. The fact of the matter is that they are the ones who have cast themselves out of the Quran, Islam, and even humanity. So I respect and revere God first and foremost, and above everything else. I will not have God supplanted by Satan. I will not have the prophet of mercy supplanted by some prophet of doom. Slavery and concubinage, in my opinion, are an assault against the attributes of God. They're an insult to Quranic ethics. And they make a mockery of Muhammad the praiseworthy, and they make him look like a mudamman, the contemptible. So my faith in God is non-negotiable. Everything else is. If it comes down to changing my ethics or changing my religion, I have only one choice. I would change my religion. I will not compromise on my ethics. However, to which religion would I turn? I believe in one God and in being good. That's Islam. So it's not so much a matter of changing religion, but of changing one's interpretation of that religion. There are as many forms of Islam as there are Muslims. If any viewers out there are struggling with issues like slavery, there's no need to leave Islam. No need. Just change your understanding and interpretation of Islam. Remember, some Christians supported slavery, others opposed it. The same thing happened in Islam. Let us not blame Christ or Muhammad for the wickedness of others. As Imam Ali said, if you need to choose between religion or reason, choose reason. Religion will never lead you to reason, but reason will always lead you back to religion. So I choose aql. And the iman's always been there.
Mm.
In talking about interpretation, and how important it is, you advocate for an occasionalist approach to interpreting the Quran, instead of the theory of abrogation. Could you explain what an occasionalist approach means and how it might be adopted today by Muslims?
So Muslim scholars claimed early on, they realized in their view that the Quran contains contradictions. And they attempted to resolve the problem by creating the theory of abrogation. Suyuti argued that 21 verses were abrogated. Ibn Salama insisted that there were 238. There are many different lists. None of those scholars agree on which verses were abrogated and by which ones.
From anywhere, from
Yeah,
what I when I looked into the topic of
it's
abrogations, from 5
yeah,
to 200 verses, and they
yeah.
all happen to be the most peaceful.
Exactly, exactly. Basically, all the tolerant verses were trumped by the intolerant ones. So the violent ones took precedent over the peaceful ones. The pluralistic verses succumbed to the supremacist ones. Basically, all the beautiful verses of the Quran were rendered obsolete, and the sword verse, kill them wherever you find them, reigns supreme. A minority of scholars objected to abrogation. Some rejected the concept altogether. There are many classical scholars, they say, we don't believe in abrogation, we accept all of the Quran. They believe in all the verses. Others advocated for an occasionalist approach, namely that different verses apply to different times and places. That way, we don't toss 200 verses of the Quran into the trash like the abrogationist would have us do. So we can harmonize and reconcile all of these verses.
So, you don't believe that the Quranic verse 47:4 justifies enslaving even like war captives? Like, how would you explain like that situation? And I would add that, Daniel Kikaju has a video on concubinage or sex slavery, if anyone wants to term it that, where he kind of puts forth the argument that it was necessary for empires to kind of I mean, for one, it was an evolution from what used to happen to war captives, but in terms of sex slavery, it was almost a necessary to have to engage in such in order to continue the population of the civilization, and that otherwise the population would deplete over a period of time because of the wars that men engaged in. And you'd have to go and watch the clip, but I'm not saying that I believed it, but he definitely tried to rationalize the situation. And I guess just going back to my question, I mean, do you see it 4-7 for justifying the enslavement of war captives?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Well, I just want to mention, if we accept abrogation, what we lose, okay? Surely those who believe in those who are Jews and the Christians and the Sabians, whoever believes in Allah and the last day and does good, they shall have their reward from their Lord, and there is no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. Abrogated. Okay. Call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good exhortation. We use that in Dawah all the time. Abrogated. Okay. Right. And if they incline to peace, incline to peace as well. Abrogated. Right.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
coming across
Yeah.
262 and in brackets for that verse. I think it's this, no, I don't think it's the Sahih, but I remember coming across a translation of that verse 262, and then in brackets it was saying that the people, the Christians, the Jews, the Sabians before the prophethood of Muhammad. That's who this
Yes.
verse is talking
Yeah.
about, not anyone after the fact.
Here's
Despite
another
the fact
one.
that the verse uses the present tense, but anyway, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There is no compulsion in religion. We all love that one. Abrogated. Abrogated. There is compulsion in religion. Okay. To you, your way, and to me, mine. To you, your religion, and to me, mine. Abrogated. Null and void. All right. So, um, again, yeah, we're talking, these are men, human beings, not God who's deciding, who are deciding what's deleted and abrogated and so on. So,
Right.
anyhow, going back to 47:4. No, I don't believe that it justifies enslaving war captives. Let's see what it says. So when you meet those who disbelieve in battle, strike their necks until, when you have inflicted slaughter upon them, then secure their bonds and either confer favor afterwards or ransom them until the war lays down its burdens. That is the command. So as many Muslim scholars have noted, both past and present, especially the earliest commentators of the Quran, they noted that the Quran presented three options only. In a battle, death, you free them, or you ransom them. Okay, they're prisoners of war. You ransom them for other prisoners of war. You ransom them in exchange of, like, war reparations or whatever. There's nothing in the Quran that says enslave them and their children and their descendants, forever and so on. So slavery is not presented as an option. In fact, in an early biography of the Prophet, the oldest one that we have to date, God actually scolds Muhammad for having enslaved people after a battle,
Mm.
right? Can you believe that? So, yeah, there is absolutely there is evidence. Uh, Yeah, there is evidence against enslaving people. And,
So,
many other verses that I could quote as well.
I mean, yeah, you mentioned already that there's a strong emphasis in the Quran about emancipation, and that there
Yeah.
are several exhortations to emancipate slaves. Um, and obviously, this is the foundational of abolitionist views within Islam. Um, you argue that you feel that Jonathan Brown, his presentation of the tradition, actively undermines abolitionist views within Islam. How do you feel that Jonathan Brown's arguments do that? How do they undermine the abolitionist movement that has existed within Islam?
Sure. Well, I regret to say that his work, in my view, empowers and emboldens both radical Islamists and radical Islamophobes, both extremes. They're the people who quote him. to justify their views. It undermines Islamic abolitionists past and present and inspires Islamic fundamentalists, Muslim grooming gangs. Yes, absolutely. They rely upon the arguments that he presents, and terrorists. On page 252 to 255, Brown presents the arguments of those who wish to revive slavery and sexual servitude as, and I quote, a morally acceptable and valid tool of statecraft. He also takes great effort to undermine any scholarly consensus that slavery is prohibited. He describes this ijma against slavery as an upstart consensus. Yeah, so.
And this begs the question, considering modern times, how the abolition of slavery has happened, so to speak. I mean, many people will say that slavery still exists in many different forms across the world. But given that the world is in agreement that slavery is an apparent evil, has the abolition of slavery led to meaningful moral reflections among Muslims today? I mean, we have seen it in the West, where, like, across the board, I have never come across. Maybe you might come across some fringe Westerners who might believe that slavery should be reinstated, but the general feel that I get amongst people in the West, specifically those of European descent whose ancestors may or may not have participated in the slave trade, there's a bit of a moral reflection that has happened where they feel a bit of remorse for whatever participation their civilization had in the enslavement of whoever. Have we seen that kind of moral reflection amongst Muslims today?
I don't believe so. Sad to say, I don't believe so. Yeah. I
I
mean,
mean,
if you yeah. I mean, if you see how they treat migrant workers in some Gulf countries, how they treat non-Arabs in general, like they have this supremacist attitude that we're the top, you know, we're the cream of the crop, and you people are all of our you're all our servants and slaves. You know.
um,
So yeah.
I mean, in terms of how Muslims specifically relate to tradition, I think this is a huge stumbling block in terms of their ability to sort of reassess past views. Given that some prominent jurists in Islamic history participated in practices like slavery, like concubinage, do you think reevaluating their ethics could perhaps change how contemporary Muslims view and interact with Islamic tradition?
I'm still thinking about the previous question, you know,
To be
meaningful
honest, I am too. I
reflections.
feel like I had a little bit more to say in response to that, but
No,
Sorry.
I
continue
mean,
your thought.
me too, but I could go on for hours and so on. It'll be a long rant. Hmm. I know in Mauritania, in Ghana, especially in Mauritania, there are Black African Muslim scholars who have examined the tradition and who are strongly abolitionist. Many of them. Now, in Mauritania, they only abolished slavery in 1971. Slave masters wouldn't emancipate them. They did it again in 1981. They still wouldn't emancipate the slaves. 500,000 black hereditary slaves in Mauritania, and they are owned. They belong to Arab and Berber men and families. It's hereditary black slavery. I can't believe, we're in 2024 and this is going on. There's over 200,000 enslaved people in the Sudan. There are millions of enslaved women, working as prostitutes and so on. I mean, that is slavery. It's the same thing as
And a
being
lot
a
of these places
concubine.
are Islamic centers of learning. I mean, Mauritania, I know because I used to
Oh,
around the
oh,
neo-trad
oh,
camp for a bit, that
and
Mauritania was a hotspot for neo-trad sending their students to learn.
oh, And they come back and they boast that I studied in Mauritania. And
They
these
never
are the
highlight the social.
Oh no, they never mentioned that. And they're proud that they studied under this scholar and that scholar. And that scholarly class, the ulama, are the biggest impediment to emancipation. They insist that it's haram to emancipate the slaves, that slavery is commanded in the Quran, and that and they will, yeah, it is, they still sell openly these slave manuals. And yeah, so yeah, it's absolutely horrific. And then, they come back. There's Biram Da Abeid. He took one of these books and he set fire to it. It was very scandalous. They did takfir of him because he did it. He's a believing, practicing Muslim, but people are selling these books. Um, yeah, it's just absolutely horrific. There are many people, like the Initiative for the Resurgence of the Abolitionist Movement, known as the IRA, in Mauritania. They're the more radical group. There's other ones like SOS Esclave and other groups. Many people, many people. But again, it's those ulama, right? Yeah, I studied traditional Islam in Mauritania. Yeah, with the slave master. Yeah, with the slave master.
And I found out nothing about the situation in Mauritania until I had to read for myself. Again, none of these things were highlighted, and it just makes you wonder, like, are we
No.
tolerant of these things that are happening? Because, when the topic of Islamic slavery or the slavery engaged in by Muslims is brought up, um, what's constantly mentioned, oh, well, slavery exists this way. Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. I feel like it's almost kind of like kicking the bucket down the road in order to deflect from what's going on in our own situation. I mean, and mind you, Muslims, hold the Europeans' role in slavery to their neck. And try to use it against them in every which way, right for right or wrong. And it's just interesting how when we turn the mirror around, we do a lot of deflecting or try to act like these things aren't happening, or try to act like other forms of slavery exist. And so we really shouldn't worry about this form that is currently existing.
Yeah. But of course, there are people out there. They tend to be Shiite Sufis, Ahmadis, Quranists, modernists, reformists. There are some traditionally trained Sunni scholars like Sheikh Mohammed Diako. Um, where's his book? Well, where is it? Where is it? Here it is. Now, he is a black African uh, Muslim jurist, Mohammed Diako. He writes in French, and this is an abolitionist treatise, right? It's called L'esclavage en Islam, entre les traditions arabes et les principes de l'Islam, between Arab tradition and the principles of Islam. Recommended reading. I hope someone will translate it into Arabic and into English. That is an excellent resource there. In French, lots of fantastic books. There's Malik Chebel, L'esclavage en terre d'Islam, Slavery in the Lands of Islam. So he studies the history of slavery in Islam, and then he traveled throughout the Muslim world in search of modern day slavery. It
Mm.
is horrific.
Well, Roxana, there you go, because she's teaches French as a second language. So, all of this is
Beautiful.
right up her alley.
Beautiful. There's The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa by John Alembila Azuma, who's a scholar from Ghana. Yes, a scholar of Islamic studies and so on. He's a Christian, though. If you really want to know what happened in Africa, um, so-called, whenever I say Islamic, it's in quotation marks. Okay,
Right.
so-called Islamic. Okay, I'm not saying that it's Islamic in any way. My colleague, Shuki El Hamal, Moroccan, the book is Black Morocco, A History of Slavery, Race, and Islam.
Mm.
Fantastic book. So yes, you know, and of course, read Dr. Jonathan Brown's book. Read it
Definitely.
and read
Definitely.
mine and read all of these other books. And then, you know, tell me which argument do you find more morally compelling? So again, your question there about, reevaluating prominent jurists. I think we need to judge people not just by what they say, but by what they do. According to Islamic sources, okay, so I'm not saying this. Imam Hassan had more than 300 sex slaves. I mean, honestly, how many does a man need? 300? Uh, According to Islamic sources, Imam Malik had 300 concubines, and he slept with a different one each night. Wow, bravo, you the man. According to Islamic sources, Imam Musa al-Kadhim, one of the Shiite imams, had 38, 40, or even 60 children from over 3 dozen sex slaves. Okay? Okay.
Is there any way of verifying
No,
these numbers? These are like the numbers you find associated with
no,
King Solomon in the Bible.
absolutely
Um,
not. Absolutely not. Okay? We don't even have their names. We don't even have, there might be the name of one or two or whatever, but there's this big list, okay, of, walads that they had, but there are no names. All right. So there is absolutely no way to verify this. I do have my theory as to why people started to claim these things, but,
I
anyhow.
mean, let's hear it. So you have
Yeah,
in
what's your theory?
suspense.
I'm very intrigued.
Well, if you were a Sayyid, you were entitled to khums and you had a higher social status. So everyone and anyone wanted to claim to be a Sayyid. And this is a very easy way to do so. Oh, I descend from this Imam and that Imam and that Imam. That's why they keep having more and more wives and concubines and so on for all these people to trace their genealogy back to them. Uh, that's my inclination. And
Mm,
also, I know for a fact that the vast majority of Sadat or Shurafa are frauds.
Mm.
DNA studies have been conducted on them, and they do not share the same paternal ancestor. Okay, so if you know anything about DNA, there's like maternal DNA, you can trace that straight, and paternal DNA, you can trace that straight. A lot of these people, they have Arab ancestry, Semitic ancestry, but not from the same ancestor. Are
mhm,
some of them descendants of the Prophet? Maybe, but most of them are just descendants of Arabs and traders and conquerors and soldiers and whatever. All right, so this is why I think they're inventing, or they wanted to justify having harems of their own. Now, if they did indeed treat women with such disdain and disrespect, I would never follow the views of any of them. Okay?
mm,
But for the record, I don't believe that these traditions are true. And many scholars have disputed the claims that Imam Hassan was a womanizer. It was the people who had harems who wanted to justify their immorality religiously. So take the Prophet, for example. Early Islamic and Christian sources speak solely about Khadija, Muhammad and Khadija, Muhammad and Khadija. The Armenian sources and the Syriac sources, just Muhammad, Khadija, one wife. And then Ayesha shows up and she appears as his nemesis, troublemaker, unfaithful wife type thing. Now we have two wives. Then we have sources that mention that he only had four wives. Because the Quran says four wives is the maximum. How could he contradict that? They say he never had more than four at any given time. Some may have died and so on and so on. Okay, so we go from one to two to four. If you read the Sirah literature, some claim that he had nine wives, others 11, others 13, others 15, others 18. As if that were not enough, some sources say that he had two concubines, four concubines. The concubines keep growing too. The later sources, the later the source, the more wives he had and the more concubines he had. By the time we reach Majlisi, the author of Bahar al-Anwar, 1,000 years after the Prophet, written like in like 1600, Muhammad is said to have had 20 wives in addition to all kinds of concubines.
mm.
So what's going on here? I think as the harems of the Caliph sultans and shahs grew larger, so did the prophet's so-called harem, right? Because after all, he needs to have a bigger harem than I do, right? And I need to justify my own harem. So, yeah, so something to consider, right?
Talking about sort of historical figures and narratives about specific wives and concubines, You've raised doubts about the historical existence of Mariya the Copt in your book. Could you explore those findings with us and the significance of the fact that perhaps she didn't exist?
Right. Well, several historians have examined this character of Mariya the Copt, the ravishing redhead, as they describe. Ornberg, a scholar, concluded that the whole story of the prophet's Egyptian concubine Mariya and their son Ibrahim is just a transposition of the older story of Abraham, Hagar, and Ismail, with additions in the form of the names of the Sasanian Shah's two Christian wives from the pseudo-historical literature of Persia to give the story more standing. David S. Powers, an American academic, a specialist in Islamic studies, has concluded that the Islamic narrative is a creative reformulation of Genesis 17. In the Islamic narrative, Mariya is Hagar and Ibrahim is Ishmael. Both women were Egyptian slaves, and both were given to men who had no son. Hagar was a gift from Sarah to Abraham. Mariya was a gift from Muqawqis to Muhammad. Both women aroused the jealousy of the wives of their respective masters, and both women produced a male child. Whereas the biblical Ishmael became the founder of a great nation, the Ishmaelites, Ibrahim died in infancy. In Samuel 12, God punished King David for his sin by causing the first son born to him by Bathsheba to die in infancy. However, Zainab did not give Muhammad a son. In this instance, the motif was transferred to Mariya the Copt, whose son Ibrahim died in infancy. Another scholar by the name of Jan M.F. van Reeth wrote that Christian Quenouillet has definitively demonstrated that the account is a legend. Maria and her sister Sirin, perhaps even her son Ibrahim, never existed, pointing out anachronisms in plausible aspects and the fact that the story only appears late in the tradition. Again, she magically appears several centuries after the fact, out of the blue. Quenouillet also succeeded in identifying the source, namely the story of Mary the Roman and Shirin the Aramaean, who became the wife of the Persian king. Another scholar, Catherine Hayne, a historian, says Muhammad's relationship with Mariya the Copt provides the basis for the religious sanctioning of sexual enjoyment of slave women. Men born of concubines who aspire to rule use the concubines Hajar and Mariya the Copt to assert legitimacy and right to rule. So, Elizabeth Urban, wrote that the men who called on Mariya had a vested interest in showing that the children of Walads could have noble genealogies and legitimate political authority. The slave status of Mariya was thus useful for the political aims of powerful men. So, from the point of view of critical, right, historians, yeah, Mariya the Copt is a myth. She was constructed to legitimize concubinage and to increase the standing of these caliphs who were the sons of concubines, right? So there's a motive there. And again, I'm just giving you their conclusions. You would have to read their studies in which they examine these traditions in meticulous detail. They're very convincing.
The term "what your right hand possess" appears in the Quran. Could you explain the meaning and how different scholars have interpreted?
Oh, that's a great one. All right. Ma malakat aymanukum. Okay. All right. So, until very recently, this expression was unattested. Okay. So, what do I mean? In the Quran, how should I explain? There are terms that have a history. okay, that we see them used in the pre-Islamic period, all right? They have cognates in other languages, right? Expressions, words, turns of phrase, legal terminology. This is one that, um, you know, it produced stumbling blocks and so on. What does this mean, right? Possessed, those possessed by the right hand. Okay. So the first thing we should note is that in some translations of the Quran it says, those your right hands possess, but that's not correct. It's in the past tense, right? Okay. Possessed, right? Those who are possessed by the right hand. It is in the preterite. So certainly, when you put something in the present and you put something in the past tense, it changes the meaning. It is in plural. So if it's in plural, it means it's gender inclusive, right? That includes both men and women, right? Women and men. So this idea that a man could have sex with those whom his right hand possess, right? So how can you say that a woman couldn't have sex with, those that are possessed by her right hand? Because it's gender inclusive and it's in the plural. Besides that, ma malakat aymanukum, it doesn't mean a sex slave. It doesn't mean a concubine. Arabic is a very rich language. They have half a dozen words to describe concubines. There's Surriya, Jariya, Ama, Mamluka, and so on. Very, very precise terms. Why isn't it using any of these other words that clearly mean concubine? So some scholars suggested that it refers to wives, because, your right hand, your oath, those that are under your oath, under your authority, and so on. Okay. Um, so yeah, some said, well, some argued that maybe they're enslaved women who are taken as wives. All right. So this brings us to marriage in Byzantium, in the Roman Empire. They had two common forms of marriage. One was called cum manu, or with hand, or underhand, or under the authority of one's hand. And the other one was called sine manu, without a hand or out of hands. All right. So the first one, cum manu, or with hands, is your typical patriarchal marriage, where the husband is the provider. He must provide economically for the woman. She is not allowed to go freely without his consent, so he has control over her movement. So she's basically a housewife. Um, she falls under the authority of her husband, but in exchange, she inherits from him. Okay. The other type of marriage in Byzantium, in the Roman Empire, was sine manu. In this marriage, the woman remained under the authority of her father until her father died, and after her father died, she was a free and sovereign woman. She was not under the authority of her husband. In the first marriage, she couldn't divorce. In the second marriage, she could. She couldn't inherit, all right, but she was able to keep all of her property, okay? Because in the other patriarchal marriage, when a woman marries a man, all of her property goes to him. All right. So I think we have here the origin of this distinction between nikah and nikah al-mutta. right? The permanent marriage and the so-called temporary or pleasure marriage. All right?
Mm,
Now, I came across a legal term in Latin, which is secundum manus sue potentiam, which means in Latin, under the authority of their hands.
mm,
So it seems to me that this mysterious Arabic expression, ma malakat aymanakum, is an Arabic translation of a Latin legal term describing a specific form of marriage, right? And so these women who were possessed by the right hand tended to be formally enslaved women. Okay. So if you married a woman, a free woman, it was a regular marriage with those rights and responsibilities that I told you. But if you married an enslaved woman, so the Romans raided some country, they bring these slaves back, they're selling slaves, and you could actually offer to marry a woman. She didn't have to accept your offer. She might get several offers, right? Marry me. And and in so doing, you free them. But they were held to a slightly to a different standard. I don't want to say it's a different standard because actually this sine manu marriage became the favorite marriage of Roman women. And in Byzantium, virtually all the women, they didn't want to have anything to do with this under the authority of the man patriarchal marriage. They
mm.
wanted to be able to get divorced when they want, keep their property, and be free, right? So that was the popular marriage. It was only gradually over the centuries that the church promoted that patriarchal form of marriage, the cum manu. So yeah, this was a very modern type of marriage that the Romans had. And so I think that that's the origin of nikah al-muta there. But also, I believe that this mamalakat aymanakum deals with uh, enslaved women, formerly enslaved women who are married, right? So
And,
not slaves, but legitimate wives under the power of their hands, under the authority of their hands. So it's
and
one interpretation.
And so, considering the proximity of the Hijaz, I mean, to Byzantium, which some of the Roman Empire actually inhabited or was in the Hijaz, this type of form of marriage was known about.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And so there's a hadith. There's a hadith that when the Prophet sent his companions for a battle, on the border, in Byzantine lands and so on, he allowed them to perform mutta. Okay? Right? So this is even in the Sunni books of hadith. They agree that it was allowed for a time. They claim that later it was prohibited. But, you know, it, it sounds like they're just hooking up for a night and everything and so on. But I don't believe that's what it was,
Mm.
right? That I believe, because that was the dominant type of marriage among the Romans at the time. So he was saying, you're going to this land, you're free to marry the women there. Okay. Now, um, and like in that patriarchal type of marriage, it's a marriage for life, and you can't get divorced and none of that. But in this other form of marriage, you were free to divorce. Okay. And in the mutta marriage, you could marry a woman for a year. You can marry her for 50 years. You can marry her for life. The main difference is that she is free. She's not under your authority. She doesn't inherit from you. She keeps all of her property. So there are some very, very close legal parallels there between these forms of marriage. And so we know there was a lot of interaction between the Arabs and the Byzantines and so on. We know that there was a great deal of bilingualism, trilingualism. We know this for a fact now that they didn't speak just Arabic. Some of them
So
knew
Greek.
Hebrew, some of them knew Syriac, Aramaic. They spoke Greek. Some of them may have known Latin. We know that many of them knew Persian as well. What do you expect? They were traders. So traders, you have these hadith about, Muawiyah, no, Abu Sufyan going and meeting with Heraclius, and they're having conversations just like nothing. Well, what language were they speaking? I don't
Right.
think Heraclius was speaking Arabic. I think it's the other way, that Abu Sufyan was speaking Greek. And we know this for a fact. We know that these people, these early Muslims, they were multilingual. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because a lot of the hadith literature, okay, was actually copied from like Zoroastrian literature, from Jewish literature, from Christian literature. They don't say it. They'll just present it as a hadith of the Prophet or a saying of the Prophet, or so on. But go and read the Talmud, and you'll say, I know this hadith. But it's the other way around, right?
Right.
They're giving you a hadith that's actually, the ruling of like a Jewish rabbi. They're just attributing it to the prophet. And there are hadith, all kinds of hadith. I found them myself, that they are just translations of apocryphal Christian literature. So anyhow, we need to open our minds.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I remember coming across that in your book, and I actually found it to be quite an eye-opener that there were different forms of marriage that existed in the Roman Empire, and then the proximity of the Hijaz to the Roman Empire. And we know from tradition that there were certain Byzantines that made their way into Arabia, Shuaib al-Rumi being one of them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, why wouldn't this form of marriage be understood or known about to the Hijazi Arabs? And then what you mentioned when the Arabs went into the lands of the Byzantine, yeah, I would expect certain practices of marriages in the Byzantium to have proliferated amongst the Arabs.
Mhm.
Maybe there might have been cross-cultural type marriages going on, but yeah, basically what you wrote about, what I read in your book makes a lot of sense. And I hope to look further into this type of marriage that existed in the Roman Empire and see how it kind of, I mean, I don't know if there are any works that kind of show the genealogy from this type of marriage into what later became known as muta. That would be an interesting work to read, if there is.
No, I don't think so. Just bits and pieces here
Okay.
and there, and I just, connected the dots.
Well, maybe that might be a bit of inspiration for your next book.
Yeah.
So yeah, still on the topic of concubinage, Brown's contention. How do you view Brown's contention that becoming a concubine was not necessarily a bad development for a female slave?
Slavery is profoundly degrading. It's humiliating and it's dehumanizing. Some pimps, and you might have to go and delete that word. It might get, it might trigger an algorithm. But some pimps treat their prostitutes better than others. But a pimp is a pimp is a pimp. Some slave masters were cruel and vicious. Others were more gentle. Okay. I have no doubt that some of them treated, their enslaved, their slaves well. Some women, however, lived in misery. Others lived in luxury. The cage may be golden, but it's still a cage.
Right.
And if life was so good, they have these programs on the Sultanate of Women and Roxelana and so on. They try to make it look like, oh, girl power and everything. But go and study the lives of those women. They were young girls. Uh, Slave raiders came, slaughtered their whole villages, killed their fathers, killed their mothers. Some of them, they were the daughters of Orthodox Christian priests. And then you're thrown in a ship, and you're brought to a slave market. Okay, maybe she lucked out, to live in the palace. All right. And others, you might have been, the concubine to a butcher or something, or, a shopkeeper. Um, but if life was so good and women were so blessed to be the slaves of these imams, caliphs, and sultans, answer me one question. Why did they poison their masters? And you will find that virtually every Shia imam was poisoned, and many of the sultans and caliphs were also poisoned. Who do
Mm.
you think did that? If I were a woman, okay, I try to imagine if I were in that position, after going through all of that, I would shank the guy in his sleep. Okay, but then I'm a guy, right? I'm a guy. But a
Yeah,
woman, yeah, poison, you cheat on him, you carry another you'll carry like a lover's son, and then he'll become the sultan. Haha, that's payback. I don't know, but I do know that they killed their masters.
I'm gonna have to look into the background of some of these concubines, but
It's
you know,
it's horrible. It's absolute. But another thing too. I mean, they were all Christians, of course. You had to become well, they were Christians, but they all embraced Islam. I mean, you had to, if you wanted to have any upward mobility or anything. But they also, and it's clear that they influenced the caliphs to protect their communities of origin.
mm,
Now, these covenants of the prophet became part of like domestic and foreign policy under the Ottoman Empire, uh, protecting Christian communities, freedom of religion, this and that, and so on. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the mothers of all of these caliphs and sultans were basically enslaved Christian women. And I think they used, their charm and skills and influence to protect their people. Okay? And so good came out of it, right? Some good came out of it. Um,
But then, like you mentioned, these are the stories of concubines that made it into elite circles. You know, you don't really hear about the stories of the concubines of butchers, shopkeepers who may have had a very different reality,
oh,
which is
no, absolutely.
something I feel people who argue for the reality of concubinage being so happy and tolerable, I think they're looking at it from a very minuscule perspective.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I don't know if I should make that comparison, but I won't. I'm not gonna go there, or I can make the comparison and you could delete it. But
Oh,
uh,
sure. Go ahead, shoot. I mean, we can
Go
always
ahead,
edit
yeah.
things
but
out.
I mean, sex workers. There's a big difference between like a streetwalker and a really, really high level, you know, yes, a call girl, right? Their clientele is very different, their income is very different, and some of those women are, I guess they're entrepreneurs. Some are not like controlled by violent men. But anyhow, yes, yes, it's just uh, how many of those women ended up, in the harem of the Sultan? Very few. Many of them were shipped off to brothels. Yeah, this is a fact. There were brothels and taverns throughout the Muslim world, and a lot of those women ended up in those places. So, it's the same thing. I mean, if you were a Slav or you were a black African, and you might be sent to the army, or you might get a better position in government, right, in administration, or you might be sent to the plantation in southern Iraq where they had plantation slavery, where they would just chain you to a post and like work you to death. So again, it's not black and white. There's a whole spectrum there of the experiences, like just in America, you know, you had Malcolm's speech, the field Negro and the house Negro. I can guarantee you that woman living in the house because she's young and pretty, she dressed well, she ate well, she got an education, she can read. Yes, she'd make love to the master and so on. Her standard of living was much better, but it's still devastating emotionally and psychologically to be in that condition. We can't forget that. We can't paint this with like rosy colors. I've even seen some women scholars, talk, I mean, yes, they're almost fantasizing about harems and everything and so on. And, they have this romantic, idyllic notion of what that meant. No. Uh-uh.
Yeah, that's another aspect that I feel that we don't doesn't get highlighted is the psychological aspect of the people who had to undergo that situation. And it's not something I really considered until reading a statement about his enslavement from the last eunuch in the Ottoman Empire. And he starts when he was just a boy in Africa and Ethiopia playing with his friends, and then all of a sudden he was snatched, and the traumatizing, the experience of not knowing where he was going, other boys crying. Fortunately, English the people, British ships that were out in the sea to prevent slave trading were able to prevent. Well, really didn't prevent his enslavement. He still ended up as a eunuch for the Sultan, somebody in high circles in Constantinople. But, just talking about the origins of his slavery, it seems like even though he was later in age, and from what I understand, eunuchs barely talked about the origins of their slavery. He seemed to be very traumatized by, or still, still had that feeling of when it first happened and how he described it.
Yes, I think on the Brother Garfield podcast, I described, I mean, it's in the book, the process of emasculation. Maybe that's why they banned my video. I don't know. It's pretty gruesome. You can imagine how traumatic that is.
Right.
It's just horrific.
In terms
Absolutely.
of the possible growth of abolitionist movements in Islam, do you think one of the reasons that so few abolitionist movements emerged in Islamic civilization is because the majority of enslaved people were women?
It's a compelling explanation, no doubt. The Muslim world was profoundly patriarchal, sexist, and misogynistic. Not just according to our standards, but according to the standards of some cultures at that time. I think most Muslim men couldn't care less about the condition of enslaved women. After all, they were the ones exploiting them. It was the fringe groups, the rebels, those who opposed the empire, who fought against slavery. They were led by men. So I'm not bashing all men, just most men. And by the way, many of the leading abolitionists in the history of Islam were the sons of enslaved women.
Mm.
They were the sons of enslaved women from every imaginable ethnic and racial background. They had daddy issues. It was the sons of slave women who became scholars of Islam and put their foot down and said, hell to the no. You will not do to other women what you did to my mama. After all, that's the golden rule. Don't do unto others what you wouldn't have them do unto you.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that at least, I mean, one thing that struck me when I was reading your book in particular is one of the big comparisons you make between Islamic slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is that the transatlantic slave trade, the majority of slaves were men. And in Islamic slavery, in the history of Islamic slavery, the majority of slaves were women. I think that that's an interesting difference to point out.
Absolutely.
And why do you think that there were so few abolition movements in Islamic civilization? I mean, even with what you said about how the slaves of the children of the women who were slaves ended up becoming strong abolitionists or very strong proponents of manumission. How do you view exceptions like the Karmatians? I mean, you mentioned the Ahmadis, the Druze, who took a strong abolitionist stance. Were similar patterns observed in the Christian tradition?
Sure. Um, Hold on a second here. The thing is, we haven't heard about these abolitionists. That's the issue, right? We just haven't heard of them. So, yeah. I mean, that there are people out there who claim that there was no abolitionist movement and that it was just a result of European influence and colonialism. There was no indigenous abolitionist movement. But we're simply not taught that. I mean, Atta ibn Abi Raha, died 732. This is very, very early Medinan scholar. He believed that the jihad verses only applied to the wars waged by the Prophet Muhammad during his rule, and that after that only defensive wars were permitted. So there you go. Just on the basis of that, there's no way you're going to be having, prisoners and slaves and concubines. You're only allowed to fight defensive wars. Abu Ubaid died 838. He said that there are only three options of just jihads. So he's already recognizing that there are unjust jihads. He says in a just jihad, pardon, ransom, or death. Slavery was not an option. Okay, so the Mu'tazila, they opposed slavery and concubinage. Qadi Abdul Jabbar asserted that slavery was, yeah, قبح لذاته وليست من مكارم الأخلاق. It was immoral in essence and not from noble virtues. So we have the Mu'tazila who were opposed to slavery. The Carmathians, oh, I mean, they're really incredible. I mean, they're demonized, of course, right? But they abolished slavery. They had African agricultural workers, but they were emancipated. They were paid. They were wage earners. And so, yeah, they were viewed as heretics and all of this stuff. But, let's say I'm there at that time and y'all Muslims, yeah, you down with slavery? Yeah, we're down with slavery. Concubinage, okay. What about you over here? Oh no, man, we ain't down with that. I'm with them. Okay, I'm gonna roll with them, man. That's it. I'm with you. Let's go. Let's fight these Abbasids and so on. So the Ikhwana Safa, the Brethren of Purity, they published this animals lawsuit against humanity.
Yeah, I have it on
Really,
my bookshelf right behind
it
me.
is talking about slavery. But, when you don't want to get your head cut off, right? You use metaphor and allegory and so on. That is an abolitionist tract right there. Then you have all these fringe groups like the Alawis, the Nusairis, the Alavis, the Bektashis, all these Ghulat groups, the so-called extremists. No slaves among them. No concubines among them. Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, the Fatimid Caliph, 1021, he prohibited slavery and concubinage. He emancipated all the slaves in the Fatimid Empire.
And it didn't
Okay.
matter Muslim or non-Muslim, because some people, they will say, oh, this person was against slavery or this Muslim figure was against slavery. And then we come to find out that they were only against the slavery of Muslims and still had no problem with non-Muslims being enslaved. But
I mean,
what the examples that you're mentioning, was this the abolition of slavery across the board?
well, I mean, my sources mentioned all slaves,
Mm,
but even if he mentioned all Muslims, see, that's the thing. 100%. It was close to 100% slaves. They were all Muslims. Okay.
mm,
Some of them were Muslims when they were enslaved. Okay,
right.
let's be very clear about that. That's what they did in Morocco and so on. It was horrific. Um, but others, they would embrace, well, if they were pagans, they were forcibly converted because according to Islamic law, only the people of the book can keep the religion. And the others, if they're not people of the book, they have to follow the religion of their master. So all of the pagans and the heathens and the Nubians and all of those people, they were all automatically, you're Muslims now. Okay, right? Yes, sir. I'm a Muslim. And others, if you wanted the opportunity to be emancipated, to have an emancipation contract, by and large, you have to be a Muslim. So
Mm.
you take your Shahada. Okay, there you go. I'm a Muslim. I want an emancipation contract. 7 years of labor, you free me. Do you agree? Some scholars thought it was obligatory to give this, the Zahiris, but most of the other scholars said it's just mustahab. It's just recommended. It's not obligatory. You don't have to free them. Okay, but the Quran, that's not what it says. That's not what it says. It says make an emancipation contract for them. Then you had Abdul Qadir Khan from Senegal. And that's where some people say, no, he was only concerned about Muslims who were enslaved. But some scholars would argue otherwise. The Ahmadiyya, from the dawn of their movement, they've been against slavery. Um, the Ottomans in 1854, the Ottomans issued a decree that proclaimed, man is the most noble of creatures God has formed in making him free. Selling people as animals or articles of furniture is contrary to the will of the sovereign creator. Okay, okay, okay. And so they tell us that, right? The Muslims were Johnny come lately when it came to emancipating slaves and so on, and they were just following the Europeans. Really?
Which
Were
really doesn't
they
sound like it.
following the Europeans in 1854? Um, okay, so we do see in our tradition, going all the way back. I say 7th century because I mean we have the proof. We have the hadith of the Prophet and the Imams. We know that through over the past 1400 years there have been voices against slavery. And we could just keep going on and on and on. And I give hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of movements and people and scholars who passed the edicts and fatwa, and up to recently, the open letter to Baghdadi. All of those Sunni scholars came together and said, no way, no more slavery. Leading Shiite scholars and so yeah, there is a strong foundation there.
I mean, I was surprised that you mentioned how certain radical Islamist groups were also against the
Yes,
idea
yes.
of,
Oh, absolutely. Uh,
maybe not ISIS, of course, but
no, no.
there were numerous other ones who said, hey, who actually applied the golden rule. If we do this to them,
Yes.
they're going to do this to us.
The Abdullah Azam, not someone that I like, but nonetheless, I'll give him credit. And the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, they said, no, we are not enslaving women. We're not raping Russian women or anything like that, because if we do that to them, they will view it as a green light to do that to our women. And so it was just an understanding, right? That we are establishing rules and regulations for our conflict and lines we won't cross. And they were wise. That was a very wise thing to do. It was very mature. So yeah, I mean, and these people, they seem moderate compared. These extremists seem moderate compared to the other extremists. This is the craziest thing.
Right. Yeah, I totally didn't expect that when I read that in your book. But this really begs the question, and it's one that is very strong in the United States within certain communities, and that's the discussion on reparations in the Western world for the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, do you think Muslim nations owe a similar debt to the descendants of those enslaved? I mean, because the argument can be made, just like it is made with the transatlantic slave trade, that this engagement in slavery that Europeans participated in stagnated in some ways the development of those African communities affected, as well as the Black American communities that were the result of what happened. I mean, the same could be said, and from what I've read, uh, yeah, a case can be made that the Trans-Saharan slave trade also stagnated the African communities and the people that it affected, which may in some way, shape, or form, not in totality, explain the current situation that you might find in certain, say, like East African or Central African countries.
Right. So the Quran, to the surprise of most, actually speaks about reparations. Believe it or not, I was very surprised to find this. It says, God made some of you excel over others in means of subsistence. So why don't you give away, so why don't they give away their sustenance to those whom their right hands possess, so that they should be equal therein? uh, is it the favor of God that you deny? So, no jurist, as far as I know, in the history of Islam ever issued a ruling based on this verse. Actually, all of their rulings were against this verse. So they all ignored it. I mean, it was so powerful and it was so revolutionary. To my knowledge, the first scholar who actually used this to say that, slavery is haram and so on was Sheikh Mohammed Diako.
Mm.
Um, yes, Sheikh Mohammed Diako, and another scholar, Cyril Moreno Al-Ajami, who is a French he's a medical doctor. He's also an Arabist and an Islamologist, a mufassir, a commentator of the Quran, translator of the Quran, who's doing revolutionary, groundbreaking work. He also invokes this verse. So this, of course, applied to the actual culprit and the actual victim, if we're talking about enslaved people. So not only were they expected to emancipate their slaves, but they were expected to compensate them as well.
Mm.
So this would apply to enslaved people in Mauritania, the women violated by ISIS and other Islamist groups. Of course, they deserve, compensation and reparations and so on. And all the money in the world will never take back their honor and heal their trauma, but nonetheless. As for crimes that were committed centuries ago, it could be argued that another principle comes into play. No bearer of burdens shall bear the burden of another. It's mentioned 3 times in the Quran.
Right.
That's the Quran, and that sums it up. The guilty are gone. The living are not responsible for those who are dead. So rather than focus on the past, we need to focus on the present. And remember, if we demand reparations for what was done to us, then others can ask reparations from us for what we did to them. Are
Right.
we going to ask reparations of Turkey for all of the for enslaving all of those people in Europe and throughout the world? I mean, they were a superpower. They were imperialist, and they had this huge slave trade. Okay, so it's going to end up the same. We'll be sending them money. They'll be sending us money. It's never. And if you speak to diplomats in Africa and so on, when they talk about reparations, they're not talking about money. They're talking about science, knowledge, technology, infrastructure. Help us out. It's not just cash payouts. I'm
Which
thinking,
which really sounds
yeah,
like how reparations started in the United States. From what I understand, people weren't asking for cash pay. It was like
yeah.
40 acres and a mule. Like give us something
No,
in
no,
order
that would have been good right there for those
yeah, right
emancipated
then for
people.
the
And it's horrible that it wasn't done. I don't think most people would want 40 acres and a mule at
now,
this
yeah, right
point.
now.
They
But
want
the equivalent would be science, technology, infrastructure. Give us a
yes,
competing chance. And so
yes.
I
And for the African people in the Americas, but also let's not forget indigenous people. Um, I mean, on some of these
I mean, and they're largely
reservations, yeah.
forgotten in
Oh,
the topic,
yes, yes. And
which
I've been
is
to many reservations and so on, and they're living in misery. They have no heating. They're heating their trailers with like gas stoves, and and
yeah,
and they
I've
died.
lived
They don't have
I've lived
running
in
water.
proximity to numerous Indian reservations when I lived in Washington State, and
You know,
I was surprised by I mean, they're not only surprised by the conditions that they're faced with, but the way other outside communities treat them and their property as well.
inadequate health care, poor education, um, uh, terrible infrastructure. Some of these reservations, you can't even access them by roads. So infrastructure, water plants, education, scholarships. Okay, scholarships. Just give people scholarships. Low interest loans, no interest loans. Help people buy homes. Help people start businesses. You know, it's not just give them fish, teach them how to fish. Yeah, I think so. So yeah, there's yeah, yep. Yeah. And then again, all these prostitutes in the Muslim world and all these enslaved people in Mauritania, I think we should focus on liberating them and emancipating them. These are very, very serious and grave issues.
Yeah, and I think Thomas Sowell put it best when he was articulating that, people spend so much time trying to right the wrongs of slavery that happened centuries ago when we have slaves today and no one speaks about. which actually in Mauritania, he actually used the example of Mauritania, which just leads to my next question. Some scholars assert that slavery in the Islamic world was not racialized. How accurate is this view?
It's patently false. Even the scholar who made that claim was forced to backtrack, and I acknowledge that. That
I'm
needs to be
sorry, was
recognized.
there a scholar who made that claim?
Yes, Jonathan Brown, in his lecture that he gave on February 7th, 2017, yes, he said that it wasn't racialized, but he retracted that. He did make a statement, and yeah, I have it here. Yeah. I mean, in 2000 and well, yeah, the 17, a couple years after his speech, he says that he admitted that slavery in Islam could become racialized. Okay, so he changed his view. He was forced to backtrack. Muslim authorities established from the onset that only non-Arabs could be enslaved. That's Islamic law. You cannot enslave an Arab. So that's fundamentally racist. So long
And
as
I
you are
believe
not,
I want to say that I read
yeah,
in the jurisprudence of not Ibn Rushd, but his grandfather, or
yeah.
it might have been his, I can't remember, but that even a Christian Arab, it had nothing to do with religion, but that an Arab that or that there was debates that even a Christian Arab couldn't be enslaved.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, Ibn Rushd. I mean, everyone should read that. I mean, it's those two volumes are, I mean, they're difficult for most people to read. But if some, and there's other books too. There's one by Javad Mughniya about the five schools of jurisprudence. But this whole thing of comparative jurisprudence, I think, is valuable. It's very important. It broadens people's horizons. There isn't just one way of doing things. There isn't just one opinion. Quite often, the opinion can range from, haram, makruh, mustahab, or wajib on the same issue, right? Some people say it's halal, some people say it's haram. There's all kinds of different perspectives. And, if you're exposed to that, I think it'll make you a more tolerant person. But Muslims were, so long as you were not an Arab, you were fair game for such predators, and that's what slave hunters are, predators. Muslims were equal opportunity enslavers. Most of the people they enslaved were Imazighen or Berbers, okay? Europeans and Asians. Those were the populations that were targeted. The duties they would perform was determined by their race.
Right.
So, like Nubian women made good nannies, Persian women made good wet nurses, African men made good guards, the Slavs and the Turks made good soldiers, Berber, Abyssinian, European, and Circassian women made good concubines, others made good singers and entertainers and dancers. There are entire books that were devoted to the topic of selecting slaves, right?
Based on race.
Buying slaves for dummies. People would buy these manuals and go to the market and right? Okay, how to pick the slave, one who'll work good here or there. So yes, slavery was profoundly racialized in the Islamic world, and it was racist to the core.
Mm. Well, Dr. Moreau, um,
Uh, Looking ahead to what you see as sort of the next major ethical challenge for Islamic scholarship. So you've sort of addressed a lot of the key ethical challenges that you've discussed already. So topic of Islamic slavery, the topic of 434, for example, the veil. What do you see as the next major ethical challenge that needs to be addressed? And how can Islamic scholarship play a role in addressing those issues responsibly?
Well, it's not just one. There are many. There are many, and it's just so many. I
good
think we
time to
need to.
plug in your controversies in Islam book.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. So, yeah, there I deal with these other books like hijab, the other one slavery, right? The other one domestic violence. But that controversies in Islam. It deals with myriad issues that are important. I think we need to remember that the Quran is not Islam, and Islam is not the Quran, right? So, the Quran is a holy book, and Islam is a religion, and all religions are man-made. They're man-made interpretations of the text and supplementary traditions and so on and so forth. Okay, so human beings have a hand in that. All right.
Right.
So the Quran is not Islam. Islam is not the Quran. So what we need to do is realign Islam with the Quran. We need to realign religious law with Quranic ethical imperatives and higher moral objectives, the subtitle of the book that you just mentioned. Yes, controversies in Islam. But to do so, we need to foster freedom of thought and expression. We simply don't have that in the Muslim world. And those people, I'm sad to say, they carry that mindset all the way over here. Okay? It's basically that thinking is haram. Um, People like me end up in jail or dead in the Muslim world. All right. There was one scholar who suggested that hijab was not obligatory. They condemned him to death in Iran. There's another scholar who suggested that the story of Jonah in the whale was not literal, but allegorical. They killed him in Iran. Seriously? The Quran itself says that some of it is literal and some is mutashabihat,
Right.
right? It's allegorical. You're
Mm.
killing people, right? For interpreting things allegorically. So, yeah, in Iran, Saudi Arabia, people have been executed for much less than what I say. That's why all major breakthroughs in Islamic studies take place in the West. There's nothing but dribble, repetition, rumination, and regurgitation going on in Islamic seminaries in the Muslim world. The ulama, are a bunch of fossilized relics. It's the dead and blind leading the dead and blind. It's like a zombie parade. So I have faith in the free world and in Western academia, so long as we can cure the woke virus that plagues universities and that has started to stifle scholarship.
Right.
Yeah, it's pushing scholars out. And that's one of the reasons I left the university because I no longer had freedom of expression. So if we are to revive Islam and the Muslim world, it requires freedom, liberty, free thinking, reason, science, and critical study. Otherwise, Islam and Muslims are beyond redemption.
Right. I don't see more traditionalism as the answer. I mean, and
No.
this is no, this is no snub against traditionalism. I believe in traditions and being traditional where it works, but not to my detriment or to the detriment of other people.
I think one ethical consideration that I think Muslim scholarship should try and focus on a little bit, and something that's particularly relevant at the moment and is a long-standing issue, is the sexualization of children. That
Oh, yes.
is unfortunately, with recently we just saw the passing of the law in Iraq, which means that now marriage is legal for age 9 and above. We've had problems in the Muslim community with very recent revelations about specific Quranic teachers, and I think the continuing sexualization of children within the faith tradition needs to be severely addressed. And I'm not saying it's unique to Islam by any stretch of the imagination, but it's the responsibility of Muslims to address it.
Right.
No, absolutely. And there are many Muslim feminists who have been addressing that issue. I've addressed it as well in some of my books. And yeah, and we have to bring that to the fore. It's deeply disturbing.
Right. Well, on that note, Dr. Morrow, thank you for this enlightening discussion. Before we close, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'll give the last word to God. What will make you know what the steep path is? It is the freeing of a slave.
And on that note, we encourage our listeners to look into these topics for themselves in order to formulate their own opinions about them. And please do not hesitate to share your thoughts with us on social media. And for those interested in learning more, we recommend Dr. Morrow's book, of course, Islam and Slavery, as well as Jonathan Brown's Slavery and Islam. And again, compare the arguments, see where you stand with them. And yeah, we value your feedback, and let us know what your thoughts of today's episode are in the comments section. And feel free to recommend any topics you'd like us to cover in the future. And again, Dr. Monroe, thank you for your time. Throughout trying to find a topic to bring you on about, we went through much of your work, not the hijab in Islam, but definitely the controversies in Islam. We read a significant portion of your Covenants of the Prophet, and under the advice of a friend of mine who read your book, Slavery, Islam and Slavery. As well as Jonathan Brown's, he mentioned that we should bring you on for that topic. And I have to say, I found your book really enlightening. I felt like you were in conversation with your reader more so than like how most academics write, which can be a bit dry in a sense. I felt like you actually a bit of your personality came out in your work. So I recommend it to all of our audience members. It was definitely an exciting read.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor.
All right. And on that note, peace, everyone.